In the Bay of Bengal, roughly halfway between India and Myanmar, there is an archipelago of islands that the modern world has largely agreed to leave alone. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are, geographically, not far from some of the most densely populated coastlines on Earth. The Indian subcontinent is visible on a clear day from their northern shores. And yet the people who have lived on these islands for tens of thousands of years have maintained, in most cases deliberately, and sometimes violently, a separation from the outside world so complete that several of their communities are among the least contacted populations in the history of modern anthropology. The most famous of these is the Sentinelese, the community on North Sentinel Island who have, with consistent and occasionally lethal clarity, made their preference for non-contact known to every outsider who has approached their shore. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chau was killed by the Sentinelese when he attempted to make contact. The incident received global attention, and then it faded, as such incidents do, back into the background of a world that has enough difficulty understanding the peoples it already knows about. But the Andaman Islanders, taken as a group, represent something that the world should pay far more attention to, not because of their resistance to contact, dramatic as it is, but because of what their DNA reveals about the deepest layers of the human story. When researchers have been able to obtain genomic data from consenting members of the more accessible Andamanese communities, the results have produced findings that connect directly to the greatest unresolved questions in the study of human prehistory. The Andaman Islands have been inhabited for at least 26,000 years, and possibly much longer. The evidence for this comes from archaeological sites on the islands themselves, which show human occupation extending back through the last ice age. During the glacial maximum, when sea levels were much lower than today, the Andaman Islands were not the isolated archipelago they are now. They were part of a much more connected coastal landscape, accessible from the mainland by routes that the rising seas of the post-glacial period subsequently drowned. The indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands belong to two broad cultural and linguistic groups. The Great Andamanese, once a diverse set of communities speaking multiple distinct languages, have been reduced by colonial-era epidemics and displacement to a tiny remnant population, now living on a small island called Strait Island, with a population of fewer than 60 people. The Jarawa, who resisted all contact until the late 1990s, have in recent years allowed limited interaction with the outside world, but remain extraordinarily isolated. The Onge live on the southern island of Little Andaman, in similarly reduced numbers. And then there are the Sentinelese, whose population is unknown, and whose choice of absolute isolation has so far been respected by the Indian government. What unites all of these communities, beneath their cultural and linguistic diversity, is a physical appearance that struck early European observers as unusual, and that early anthropologists, working within the deeply problematic racial frameworks of their era, described in terms that caused harm that persists to this day. The Andaman Islanders are small in stature, with dark skin and tightly coiled hair, and they were categorized by early 20th century anthropologists as Negrito populations, a category that grouped them with similarly appearing peoples from the Philippines, the Malay Peninsula, and the forests of Central Africa. The physical similarities were real. The implication that these similarities reflected a shared primitive stage of human development was a fabrication of racial science that the genetics has comprehensively demolished. The genomic data from the Andaman Islanders, particularly the Great Andamanese and the Ong for whom DNA has been obtained with informed consent, has produced findings of extraordinary significance for the reconstruction of early human migration out of Africa. The key finding, established across multiple studies beginning in the 2010s and refined in subsequent work, is that the Andaman Islanders represent a deep branch of the modern human family tree that separated from other populations very early in the out-of-Africa expansion. The ancestral population that produced the Andaman Islanders appears to have diverged from the population that would eventually produce all other non-African populations at a very early stage of the out-of-Africa migration, possibly as long ago as 50,000 to 65,000 years. They are not descended from later waves of migration into South Asia. They are not derived from the agricultural expansion from the Near East that transformed most of South and Southeast Asia in the Holocene. They represent, in the genetic terminology used by the researchers who have studied them, a basal position in the non-African human family tree, one of the first branches to separate from the lineage that would produce the rest of the human world. This makes the Andaman Islanders, in a specific and important genomic sense, the oldest surviving human population outside of Africa. Not because they are primitive in any meaningful sense, but because their ancestors were among the first modern humans to leave Africa, followed a coastal route southward and eastward through South Asia, and reached the Andaman Islands at a time when the rest of the world east of Africa was still empty of modern humans. And there, on their islands, they remained, while the rest of the human story unfolded around them. The connection between the Andaman Islanders and the broader question of early human migration out of Africa is where the science becomes genuinely compelling. The Out of Africa hypothesis proposes that modern humans left Africa and spread across the world beginning roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. The primary route of this expansion has been debated, with competing models proposing a single dispersal event and others proposing multiple waves. The genomic position of the Andaman Islanders is one of the most important data points in this debate, because their deep divergence from other non-African populations is consistent with the hypothesis that their ancestors were part of an early coastal migration that proceeded southward along the Indian Ocean coastline before the main body of the Out of Africa expansion took its more northerly route into Central Asia and Europe. This coastal route hypothesis, sometimes called the Southern Dispersal Model, proposes that the first modern humans to leave Africa followed the coastline of South Asia southward and eastward, living off marine resources along the way, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and Australia before the populations that moved through the interior of Eurasia. The Andaman Islanders, along with the Ong and the Jarawa and the Sentinelese whose DNA remains unsampled, would be the living remnants of this early coastal wave, preserved on their islands, while the populations that followed them along the coast were subsequently transformed by the agricultural expansions and demographic movements of the Holocene. The connection to population Y, the mysterious genomic signal we discussed in our episode on the Amazonian peoples, adds another dimension. The Andaman Islander genomic profile, or something closely related to it, appears to be what population Y in South American populations is pointing toward. The ancient genetic signal found in the Surui and Caritiana peoples of the Amazon basin, which we established had no clear explanation in the standard Beringia model, shows its closest affinities to populations like the Andaman Islanders and the indigenous peoples of Australia and New Guinea. The Andaman Islanders are, in a sense, the living reference population for one of the most puzzling unresolved questions in the study of American prehistory. The situation of the surviving Andaman Islander communities today is one of extreme fragility. The Great Andamanese, once a population of thousands speaking a dozen distinct languages, have been reduced by colonialism, epidemic disease, and displacement to fewer than 60 individuals who now speak a mixed Creole rather than any of the original languages. Several of those languages are already extinct, their last speakers having died within living memory. The Ong number approximately 100. The Jarawa, the most recently contacted group, are estimated at a few hundred individuals. The Sentinelese are unknown in number. These communities are not simply indigenous peoples at risk. They are, in the genomic terms that this series has been exploring, irreplaceable archives of a chapter in human prehistory that cannot be recovered from any other source. When the last speaker of a great Andamanese language died, a language that encoded tens of thousands of years of human ecological and social knowledge was gone forever. When an Onge elder dies without passing on the traditional navigational knowledge that allowed their community to survive on these islands for 26,000 years, that knowledge is gone forever. And when a community disappears, the specific genomic archive it represents, the particular combination of ancient lineages and population history that no other living group preserves, is gone forever. The Andaman Islanders are the oldest surviving non-African human lineage. They are the reference population for some of the most important unresolved questions about early human migration, and they are disappearing faster than science can document what they represent. The Sentinelese present a particular philosophical challenge that the science cannot resolve. They have chosen isolation. Their choice, made repeatedly and forcibly clear over centuries of contact attempts, is not the absence of choice. It is the most consistent and clearly communicated choice any human community has ever made about its relationship to the outside world. The Indian government's policy of non-contact with North Sentinel Island respects that choice, and is, whatever its practical limitations, the correct ethical position. The science we have about the Sentinelese is minimal precisely because we respect their choice. We cannot sequence their genomes. We cannot document their languages. We cannot recover the ecological and cultural knowledge they carry, and we should not. The right of a human community to define its own relationship to the world is not conditional on whether the rest of the world would benefit from access to their knowledge. But the existence of the Sentinelese, and the fact that their genomic profile remains entirely unknown, is a reminder of the limits of the ancient DNA revolution. The revolution has been extraordinary. It has recovered stories that no written record preserved. It has challenged narratives that had stood for centuries. It has placed living communities in their correct position in the human family tree with a precision that was unimaginable 50 years ago, and yet there are still human communities whose deepest stories remain sealed, by choice, from the molecular reading that has opened so many others. The Andaman Islanders were never what the early anthropologists thought. They were not relics of a lower stage of human evolution. They were not Negrito primitives in need of civilization. They were, and are, the descendants of the earliest modern humans to leave Africa, people who reached their islands tens of thousands of years ago, and who have been living there, in their own knowledge and their own way, for longer than any civilization the world has produced has existed. Their isolation is not a failure to reach the modern world. It may be the most successful long-term human survival strategy the species has ever executed. The genome confirms the antiquity of that success. The choice of isolation confirms its intentionality, and the combination of the two is something that the modern world, with all its connectivity and all its science, has not yet found the right words to describe. There is one thing the ancient DNA can tell us, even without the Sentinelese, that changes the entire framework through which we should understand the Andaman Islanders. Their deep genomic divergence from other non-African populations does not make them more primitive. It makes them more ancient. Those are not the same thing. Ancient is not a synonym for undeveloped. The Andaman Islanders are not in an earlier stage of human evolution. They are at a different position in the human family tree, one that was established 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, when their ancestors were among the first modern humans to explore a world that no human had yet seen. The people who crossed to the Andaman Islands in the deep past did not know they were making history. They were doing what humans do, moving, exploring, finding food, building communities, transmitting knowledge to the next generation. They chose an island landscape rich in marine resources and forest foods, and they built a way of life there that sustained their communities across 50,000 years of climate change, sea level rise, and the demographic upheavals that transformed every other part of the human world. That is not a small achievement. It is, in its own terms, one of the greatest long-term human success stories in the history of the species. And the molecule, which reads the record of that success in the genomes of the people who carry it today, is only the most recent instrument to recognize what was always there. The Andaman Islanders were never what we thought. They were always something more extraordinary than any framework we brought to understanding them was large enough to contain.